Good afternoon, folks. My name is Herbert Niccolls, Jr., and you're going to have to excuse me if I'm a little nervous and, frankly, a little bit shook. I'm going to talk today about things that I haven't talked to anybody about except for my brother, my wife, not even my son. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my life, and it's a little bit of a shock for me to tell it here because of those cells back there. You see, I spent the better part of 8 years in one of those cells. It started when I was 12 years old. And those cells are 6 feet wide and they're 9 feet deep, except for that triangle where they put the bucket. And the bucket is what you use for a toilet. And once a day, you empty the bucket. And those cells don't have much heat. They're awfully, awfully cold in the winter. And in the summer, it would get so hot that between the smell and the heat, inmates would pass out or they would throw up. And I spent the better part of 8 years in a cell like that. But I'm really getting ahead of myself, so let me go back to where it all began. I was born in 1919 in Star, Idaho. I would become one of 9 children. I was the middle child. I had 2 little sisters that were twins. The rest of us were boys. Our mother was overwhelmed, so I think we were probably awfully active for her. And my father never held a steady job. We lived on a farm. We did have a barn. We had a little house. And we had a chicken coop that we called the turkey house. But with 9 children, 11 mouths to feed, we were always hungry. And I don't remember very often that I had a pair of shoes. So we were very poor when we lived there in Star. But to tell you the truth, well, I mean, one of the things you learn when you're hungry all the time, you learn to find food anywhere you can. And I remember stealing pieces of bread crusts that they would save up to feed the chickens. And I would hoard them, and if I got hungry at night, I'd chew on a little piece of bread. Now, it was hard to grow up hungry, but it was much worse to grow up afraid. And life for us kids was full of a lot of terror. I remember one time my brother Wesley and I were fighting, and I don't know what we were arguing about. We were boys. We were brothers, and we got in an argument, and my father just went into a rage and started screaming at us and threatening us. And that day, my mother tried to intervene. They're just children. And my father turned on her. And he slapped her, and then he hit her in the face, and then he hit her again, and he hit her again, and the blood began to flow. And we thought the blows would never stop. We lived with that. And then I remember one day I was over at the neighbor's. I liked to go over at the neighbor's house. They were kind of happy people. They were Quakers, and they treated me kindly. And they had a puppy well, I had several puppies, but one of them I really took a liking to, and they said, if you want, you can take that puppy home with you. So they gave me some twine, and I tied it around the puppy's neck, and it followed me home, and my brother Wesley and I were really excited about that puppy, you know, and it was frisking around and barking and everything, and then my father came home. And my father yelled at us, "Who brought that dog home? Didn't I tell you we didn't need another mouth to feed?" And he pointed the gun that he'd been hunting with. He pointed it at Wesley, pointed right at his head, and said, "Why did you do that?" Wesley said, "Not me, Father, not me." And then he pointed the gun at me. "Why did you do that?" "Not me, not me." You learn to lie when you were a child, family like that, and you learn to be pretty good at it. And Wesley was trying to fiddle with the rope and untie the dog, because the dog kept barking. And my father, after he pointed the gun at me, he pointed the gun at the puppy, and he fired. And we had to bury that dog. We lived in that kind of family. My father was a mean man. One day a tent came to town, and they started holding a tent revival in, and my grandmother, my father's mother especially, was very religious, very stern, and of course they went to the revival, and my father came home one night and said, "I'm going to be a great evangelist." He had found the Lord, and he was going to save the world, and then at the end of that revival, my father said, "I need to go and get some Bible study," and so he packed up a few things and he left. And the rest of us were left to try to fend for ourselves. My mother, it was late in the summer, and there was still a lot of harvest to do and a lot of work to do, and we did the best we could. And my mother farmed us out as if she could, and we had to work very hard when that happened, but at least we got fed. And my mother would take in little odd jobs, maybe a little sewing or something that could help a little bit, and that was a hard time, and we were really hungry during that time. Finally, in November, my grandmother succeeded in getting her son out of the insane asylum in California. You see, he hadn't just taken his Bible, he had contracted syphilis and had gone to his head. So he came back, and when he came back, he wasn't just a mean man, he was a crazy mean man. And he was, we would, as children, we were so afraid of him, we'd just sort of walk on tiptoes, and you wouldn't dare hardly move for fear that he would yell at you. And then one day, my sisters, the twin sisters, came running into the house, and they said, "Daddy has a gun." Well, my grandmother had allowed him to get a gun again. He'd probably told her that he needed it for hunting, and he did hunt and fish, and that helped put food on the table. The neighbor lady was visiting, and when they heard that, Mom and the neighbor lady got really anxious because Dad hated the neighbor lady. He thought she was meddling in his affairs, and so shortly after that they looked out the window and they saw him coming, and he had a gun, and they went running out the door and tried to get away. And what we heard my father's voice yelling, "Prepare to meet your Jesus," and then we heard a gun go off. And we were, of course, terrified, and we heard my mother screaming, and she had the baby with her, and then we heard voices from the neighbor and the hired hands. It took 6 of them to hold him down and hog tie him until the sheriff got there. That's one of the last times I saw my father, but what I remember most is the neighbor lady lying there by the gate, and it was a horrible day. All we could do was just shake. We were so terrorized. In many ways, my mother was a broken woman after that. She didn't know how she could take care of 9 children by herself, and my older brothers were some help. I was only 8 years old at the time, and so she farmed us out. And then there was a day that this car came, parked in front of our house, and this lady got out, and the older boys, including me, were gathered together, and she told us she was going to take us to a better place. So we got in the car, and that's the last time I saw my mother for a lot of years. In many ways, I did go to a better place. The Mitchell family, they were a good family. They lived in Shoshone, and Mrs. Mitchell was a teacher and a principal, and they really wanted to help me. And I would go to her classes, and she would teach history and science and reading and geography, and I loved to read. And I would almost always get a star on my paper if I turned it in, and that felt really good. But you know, I never really trusted anybody, and I couldn't get over the fact that my mother had given us up, and so I started stealing like I'd learned to do, and they would talk to me, and I would say I was sorry, and then I'd do it again. And finally, after about a year, they said, we can't keep going on like this. And that's when I got sent to the children's home in St. Anthony. And I was there for a while, and there were other kids there that had a lot of trouble in their life, and so you know, I made one friend at least, and it was fun to play with the other kids, and they fed us 3 meals a day, and it wasn't so bad. But you know, I was always thinking maybe I thought too much, and I figured out that they had this safe in the office, and I figured out there must be money in there, and I told my friend, you know, I think we could figure out how to get into that safe, and then we'd get some money, and then we could run away, and we could be on our own, and my friend didn't want to do that. So I kept scheming, and then I realized there across the way, these people had this car parked, and I'd learned a little bit about cars and how they worked, and I was pretty good with machinery and mechanics and stuff, and so I saw them turn the key and push the starter and you know, push the throttle and release the clutch, and I knew where the brake was, and I saw them shift the gears. And I thought, you know, I think I can do this. And so I went across the street, and I turned the key, and I started it up, and the engine started, and put it in gear, and away it went. And I pushed it down, and it went faster, and it was really a neat feeling to be behind the wheel of a car. I could barely see over the dashboard. I was less than 5 feet tall, but it was pretty exciting to be going along the road in that car. Unfortunately, I came to a curve, and I didn't know how to turn the wheel very well, and pretty soon the car was in a ditch, and then it was rolling over. And that's why I got sent to the state industrial school. And kids were a little tougher there. And pretty soon my grandmother was working, and she managed to get me released into her care. By then she'd moved to Orofino, because that's where the insane asylum was. And she thought if she could move to Orofino, then she could keep talking to the officials and get her son released to her care. And so she thought maybe if I was there, that would help her cause. And she told him I'm going to make a good boy out of him. And you know, I kept doing some of the things that got me in trouble, and she would beat me, and she would take food away from me, wouldn't feed me until I'd repent of my sins and say I was sorry, and then maybe she'd relent and I'd get some food again, and then I'd get in trouble again. I did go to school, and the principal of the school in Orofino kind of took a liking to me because I was good at school, and said, well, I think I can help him. And so, you know, he kind of took me in for a while, and that went along pretty well until I stole another car. And that time the police caught up with me, and I finally had to pull over, and I got sent back to the state industrial school. And that time I was there for a long time. But it wasn't so bad because I had shoes and better clothes than I was used to, and 3 meals a day. And on Friday nights, they showed movies. I love movies. They were just wonderful. I was so fascinated with them, and I loved to read these books and these different novels and all these things. And it was, you know, there were some really good things about that. Well, after 15 months, my grandmother had moved to Asotin, and she lobbied to get me released to her care. And so we ended up in Asotin. Grandma's idea was that if she moved across the state line, then the people in Idaho would figure out if we release this guy and he gets into trouble, it'll be another state's problem. She thought maybe that would work. So I came into town, and you know, I could be polite, and I could say yes ma'am, no ma'am, and sir, and please, and all of those things. And you know, they said, what a nice boy. Until I got caught stealing, and then somebody left a car with the keys in it, and I got in trouble with that. And pretty soon, not many people wanted me around. And I didn't like Asotin nearly as well after that. And Grandma, every time I'd get in trouble, she'd beat me, and I'd get in real bad trouble with her. And then she would send me to my room and not feed me, and I would sneak out in the middle of the night and get some food, and then pretty soon she locked me in the room. And so I began to think of, you know, I'm 12 years old now. I could run away to Canada, and I could be a trapper, like that book that I read about trappers. And so I began to think of how I was going to do that. And so one day I was over at a friend's house, and his grandpa was, we called him Colonel Fulton. He he had been in the Philippines, and he'd brought back souvenirs, and one of them was a pistol. And he just left it laying around. Well, if he left it laying around, maybe I could borrow it. And so I took it, and I even took a boot top, and I fashioned a holster so I could have it under my overalls. And I felt powerful when I had that gun, you know. And so and the next day I went to a store and I negotiated. I managed to get 5 bullets for it, and I went out by the creek where there was enough noise that they wouldn't hear, and I put a bullet in, and I fired it, and boy, that made a big sound, and it made me feel really powerful to have that gun. And so the next day I was playing with my friend Murphy, and I thought maybe I'd spend the night with him, but they had lots of kids themselves, and finally went to the neighbor's house, and we were having dinner. Well, my grandma, when I wouldn't come home, would send the sheriff looking for me, and there was a knock on the front door, so I ran out the back door, and I hid for a while until the sheriff was gone, and then I thought I better find a place where he won't find me. So there was this place under a bridge that had kind of a hole where some animals had been, and I was pretty small, so I could get in there, and I knew he wouldn't find me there, and so I just stayed there until everything quieted down. But about midnight I was cold, and I was hungry, and I started thinking about the People's Supply Store where they had candy and gum and stuff that I was thinking about. And so I snuck out from under that bridge, and I walked down to the main street, and it was very quiet. I went to the back alley and the back door, and I broke the glass and reached in so I could get inside the store. And I found the candy and the gum and had a little bit and put a bunch of it in my pocket, and even managed to get into the cash register, and there was $2.82 in there. And then I heard footsteps on the front porch. And so I just quick noticed a vinegar barrel, and so I hid behind that barrel. There were some boxes, and I moved them around so they wouldn't see me. And then I heard footsteps coming into the place, and then I heard the sheriff's voice saying, "Come on out now before we get hurt." And he just patiently kept moving around, just walking around. I wasn't coming out. And I was thinking real fast. And I thought, if I fire off a shot, it'll scare him, and then I can run out the back door and get away. So I was thinking about that, and the sheriff kept, pacing around. I heard the footprints, and then somebody turned on the lights, and I jumped up and I fired the gun, and the sheriff was right in front of me, and he collapsed on the floor. And I ran and hid behind a roll-top desk, and pretty soon they were yelling, and then I heard the deputy's voice, "Come on out or I'll kill you." And I knew I couldn't get away, so I threw the gun over the top of the roll-top desk, and I started to work my way out, and he grabbed me by the coveralls. It was right in my face. "Why did you do that?" And I'd think real fast, and I said, "He told me to do it. He told me." And then I talked about Murphy's grandfather and how he told me he was going to pay me $2 and I could go to Canada with it. I just made up this story. Well, pretty soon I was being led out the front door of the store, and people in the community gather, and they were looking at this kid that was 5 feet tall and skinny, and realizing this kid shot the sheriff of Waukegan County. Shot the sheriff. And then I was put in jail, and then pretty soon Murphy's grandfather was also in jail. Pretty soon there was a crowd outside, and they were saying, "Let's hang him." And then the deputy was out there saying, "No, no, go home, let the law settle this." And the crowd sort of dispersed, but there was still a lot of yelling. And then that next day, we were put in the back seat of a car, and they drove out of town and drove along the Snake River, and then they drove up this winding road to Pomeroy. And I was put in a cell there. And the next, they had good food there. The next day, the deputy came in, and we played a game of checkers, and I won. I always won at checkers. And he told me I was a good, smart kid, and talked to me a while, and he said, "Well, tell me again that story." And I had it down. I told exactly what I thought I was going to tell. And he listened, and then he said, "That's not really what happened, is it?" And I started crying. I said, "I was just sore because he wouldn't let me spend the night." And I told him the truth. Well, I spent a few days in jail there, and then pretty soon I was in court for trial. And the trial wasn't so bad, really. I was the center of attention. It made me feel really important. And a woman even came, and she handed me a whole bag of chocolate chip cookies. And I started eating those as the trial was going on. And one of the men in Pomeroy had bought me a brand new suit. And I looked very elegant, I thought. And they wanted to take my picture. And it wasn't so bad. But then Colonel Fulton took the stand. At the end of him telling the story about me stealing the gun, he just yelled out, "He's a murderous little thief. He should be hanged." And that scared me. Besides, I wasn't feeling so good after eating the whole bag of cookies, so I went to the bathroom and threw up, and I was kind of nervous. And then after a while, it was time for the jury to leave the courtroom, and then they came back and they said guilty. And then pretty soon the judge was saying life in prison. And that's how, as a 12-year-old boy, I became an inmate at the Washington State Penitentiary. And I was placed in a cell like that. But I was really lucky. The warden knew that I didn't belong with the other prisoners, so he sort of put me in a cell separated from them. I could still hear them yelling and threatening and all of that. And during the day, after a while, they let me go to the library. And there were all kinds of books, and I loved to read. I would spend the day in the library, and I wouldn't eat with any of the other prisoners. So I just kind of had my own world, and Mr. Miller and Mr. Ash were tutors, and the librarian was really good to me, and so I spent my days reading, and after a while, somebody from the school would bring in lessons for me to complete, and I would complete them. I actually got a diploma from Walla High School eventually. There were some hard times. I remember the riot in '34, and I was in the library, and some of the inmates got in, and, well, it was not a good day. And to be honest, I was terrified the whole time. And there weren't any other kids to play with. So it was a different kind of life. But then in November of 1939, they told me I was going to be moved to Eastern State Hospital at Medical Lake. And that was one of the best days of my life, because as I'd read, I'd been fascinated with airplanes, and they put me in an airplane. And I got to fly in that airplane. I got to see this valley and all of the wheat fields and all of that. And then we landed in Spokane, and they went to, and I was there in the state hospital for a little over a year. And finally, then I was released. The governor finally said, well, we can release him under close custody to Seattle. And they put me to work in a machine shop. I wasn't really good at that kind of work. And then pretty soon let's try a bakery. And they did the bakery. And then pretty soon, it was 1941 in December. And a lot of men were signing up to go to war. And they needed people, especially at the Todd Pacific Shipyard. And they had figured out that I was really good at math, and I was really good with machines. So I got hired there. I had a real job, and I had money. I bought a car. And then I bought another car, and then I traded for another car. And I could get out on my own and do some things. And the Remington Rand people that made those machines really liked my work, and they knew, and I was always the first one to learn how a new machine would work and to teach other people, and I worked long hours and worked really hard. So in 1945, when they weren't building ships like they were before, they laid off a lot of people at Todd Shipyard, but Remington Rand said, if you can find a job working with our machines, we'll see that you get that job. Well, Mr. Ash, my tutor, had always loved to tell me stories about Hollywood, and I love movies. And I actually got an interview with 20th Century Fox, and I got permission to leave the state. And so I drove down to Los Angeles and had the interview and got hired in the accounting section, working with those tabulating machines, and I worked long, long hours because I really wanted to do well, and I figured out ways for their operation to work better, and I was always learning how a new machine worked, and they liked my work, and I had a whole new life in front of me. And then in 1955, something happened that I guess I never thought would happen. A friend invited me to dinner, and he also invited this woman named Patricia to a dinner. She was young and beautiful, and she had a wonderful laugh, and she was really smart, and she laughed at my jokes, and we just hit it off. And pretty soon I had fallen head over heels for her. And she was still married at the time, but she'd separated from her husband. And so we started talking about being together for the rest of our life. But I knew that sooner or later I was going to have to tell her the other part of my story. And so one evening, I sat down and Warden McLaughlin, who'd been like a father to me sometimes, had said, you know, honesty is the best policy, and I told her the story. And I thought, well, that's going to be the end of this. At the end of the story, she said, but you were just a little kid. And we were married in Mexico, got a divorce, and got married the same week, came back. A year or two later, she was expecting. And it was, we were worried about whether she could carry a child or not, but there was then the day that our son Jonathan was born. I just love that child, and I wanted so hard to be the father I never had, and I just worked so hard. The best days of my life sometimes were Sundays. I had Sunday off, and we'd go to Santa Monica Pier, and we'd fish off the pier, and we'd just spend the day together. It was just so wonderful. I guess maybe the thing I can say the most is, actually when I was in the bakery in Seattle, one day this customer came in and he looked somehow strangely familiar. And then he said, "Are you Herbert?" It was my brother Wesley. He found me. And we went out to dinner, and then we spent evenings together, and we did camping together, and I told him my story. He had no idea I'd been in prison. And one day he asked me, what was prison like? And I said, it saved my life. Saved my life. But it wasn't just people like the warden and the librarian and other people. There was one woman in particular. I only met her a few times, but her name was Mrs. Lamson. And she was a champion for getting me released. And she's here today. So she's going to tell you a little bit about her side of the story.
So my name is Mrs. Armine Lamson. When I was young, we were living in Armenia, and my father was the Protestant minister, and we managed to escape from there because it was during the Armenian massacre, and we went to Germany, and I was educated there, and then we ended up coming to the United States. And education was always very important to me, so I thought I wanted to be a doctor because I knew I wanted to help people, having been inspired by my father. So I went to Johns Hopkins, and of course women were having quite a difficult time being doctors then, so I got a 4-year Bachelor of Arts in pre-medicine, and I married a doctor. My husband is Otis Lamson, and he is a very prominent doctor in Seattle, and a fine man. And so I started about what I did was most inspired to do, and that was helping people and helping the community. So I started the Lighthouse for the Blind, and I started the free parental clinic in Seattle, which basically gave free medical care for parents who had children. And I was very active in all kinds of causes, from the PTA to whatever, and I enjoyed my life as Dr. Lamson's wife. I belonged to the Sunset Club, and we had a wonderfully comfortable life and a beautiful home on Lake Washington. And we had 3 wonderful children who were very, very successful and very smart and attractive, and everything was just fine. One day, I read in the Seattle Times this story that I just couldn't believe that would be happening. They talked about a 12-year-old boy who had shot the sheriff in Asotin County. Well, the first thing I thought, oh, this can't be. This has to be an exaggeration. But no, I read on, and then there were more stories, and then I had heard other people in other cities talking, and they were saying, this just can't, it can't be happening. But sure enough, there was a boy named Herbert Niccolls, and he was going to be tried, in which he eventually was. And they wanted to hang him. In fact, one of our Supreme Court justices had even suggested that he would always be a menace to society, and therefore they should hang him. That there was no two ways about it. And then a number of other people agreed. So when he was first arrested and held in the little jail in Asotin, he was at risk of being lynched or taken to the state penitentiary and given the death sentence. Well, I thought there has to be something I could do. This was just not in my nature just to let things lie, especially when it came to children. And I thought of my own kids and how healthy and happy they were, and I thought, I have to do something. So I had one time met Father Flanagan of Boys Town, and I wrote him a letter, and I said, are you familiar with this? And he, of course, said, oh, I was going to contact you because this is in your state. And he was very concerned that this boy was going to be incarcerated in a penitentiary. So I got on a train and I went down to Omaha and I met with Father and we talked over the situation. And part of the problem in Washington State is that if you were very young, younger than 18 years old, and you committed a violent offense, there was really nowhere to put you. If you're older than 18 and had committed a shooting or murder, they would automatically, you'd be tried, and the penitentiary in Walla Walla was, of course, the natural place. But if you were younger, they had no idea what to do because the state juvenile facility, which had started about, 20 years earlier, was basically meant to just house children. Some of them had just run away from home, some of them had no parents and were orphaned, but it was a catch-all for children who had no place to go. And they were not well treated. And so Herbert Niccolls fell between the cracks. He couldn't go to the juvenile facility, he couldn't go to the penitentiary, at least not legally. So the court decided that where they would put him is that they decided that Herbert was far too dangerous to be sent to a juvenile facility. So they figured that if they were going to break their law, they were going to send him to the penitentiary, and which is exactly what happened. Well, Father Flanagan and I began talking, and of course he was very upset about it, and he started his radio campaigns that he would get on the radio, and dear radio friends, languishing in a cell is a little boy who's never known a mother's love or a father's guidance. And he started drawing a lot of attention, and a lot of people started writing letters, as Father Flanagan had said, write to Governor Hartley. He said, write to Hartley in Olympia and ask him to release the boy to Boys Town. Well, Roland Hartley had been a friend of ours. My husband and I had contributed to his campaign, and we were good members of the Republican Party. But Roland and I disagreed on this one. I wrote to him, and he said, don't mind your pretty head. This is not of your concern. This is a dangerous child. Well, I thought to myself, he is still a child. So at Father Flanagan's request, I went to see Herbert at the penitentiary. And what I saw, I will never forget. I remember that the warden led me back down this long, narrow, very dark hallway. And doors would open, they'd clang shut with this loud, final sound that would just echo through me. And then in this one cell, by himself, with lattice work, exactly like those there, was this little boy. Can you stand up a second and come here? He was just about her size, maybe a little bit taller, and he was very thin. And he was in jail. And he was standing there, and he was very polite, and he was not too much bigger than she was. Okay, thank you. And so he was very tiny. And I couldn't believe it, that he was in this jail. And it stunk there. I got my hanky out and I held it at my nose because my eyes were watering. It was very hard for me to even talk to him, but I did, and I got to know him. And I asked, well, how do you spend your day? And he says, oh, I love to read. I've got all the books here and the food is good. And you would think that he was in this wonderful place. It was a place that I could barely stand to be on the outside of the cell, not in. I mean, he had to use the bucket as a toilet, and so did everyone else. So you can imagine the smell, especially in the heat, and it was just intolerable. And there were rats. At one point, I saw one coming, and I leaped up onto the cell like this. And Herbert was trying to reassure me, it's okay, they'll go away, they'll just sniff your shoes, and then they'll go away. Well, I didn't really want any rats sniffing my shoes or anywhere around me, let alone for this child inside the cell. So I was very concerned. So I asked the warden, I said, I want that cell measured. I want to know exactly, because I'm giving a report to Father Flanagan. So I was horrified at what I saw, and Father Flanagan and I began our fight. And it was against Roland Hartley, and I went down to see him on a number of occasions, and he dug his heels in and absolutely said he was not releasing the boy anywhere, to Boys Town or any place else. He just refused. He said he belongs in prison. And then, to make matters worse, Herbert's grandmother, who had always been abusive to him, went and she wrote to the governor and asking that no matter what, that he not be released, Herbert not be released until his sentence was done. Well, he was actually given a life sentence. So that was indefinite. And she felt that this was God's will and he should not be out, and certainly not to a Catholic place like Boys Town. And she was, very, very vehement about that. And of course, it hurt his opportunities to get out. Well, as time passed, Roland Hartley absolutely refused, but in 1933 there was an election, and Roland was out. Father Flanagan and I exchanged telegrams, and it was a high-five day, even though we didn't high-five then, but it was very exciting because he was out, and then Clarence Martin was in. So we thought there must be hope. With Clarence Martin, there must be hope. But Clarence Martin took his time. He did come to the penitentiary, and then he was very impressed with Herbert too. And as things, they've discovered they had the same birthday. So they went, he kept visiting, and then Clarence had this idea that maybe he would just keep going to school in the prison there, where the superintendent of Walla would come and give him books and work to do, and then they'd start using him as a teacher to other inmates because he was so smart. And so that was working out. But in the meantime, Father Flanagan and I kept saying, all right, Clarence, when are you going to get him out? He's still a child, and the longer he's in here, the less likely he's ever going to be able to be redeemed. So finally, right about the time when Clarence Martin's term was going to be over, and he decided to send Herbert on to Eastern State for a year, and if he had been analyzed by a psychiatrist and found to be of sound mind, that he would be paroled. So Clarence helped him, that eventually happened, and Clarence helped him get a job, multiple jobs in Seattle, and until one felt right. And time after time, Clarence had to write a letter to the parole board. Even after he was no longer governor, he was still intervening and saying, leave the boy alone, just leave the boy alone. And he was instrumental in letting him leave the state so he could start life again. I'd even heard that Herbert Niccolls had even made a movie called Journey to Freedom. Now with a name like that, you would really think that it might have something to do with his own journey to freedom, but it wasn't. It was a Cold War era film, but I had to think that just possibly when he named that he just might have had his own journey in mind, since he had certainly made a journey, certainly from in slavery and the pain of his childhood through prison, and then on to life in Hollywood, where he was hobnobbing with celebrities, and life was quite good for him, even though he always held that secret close at hand. As for me, I went on raising my children, and at one time I was even asked by reporters point blank, well, Mrs. Lamson, would you take him into your family? And I thought about it a minute, and I thought, well, would I? I'm asking the rest of the world to let him out. Would I take him into my family? And then I answered the only thing I could, and I said yes. Well, it turned out that I didn't have to take him into our home, but I had done everything I could to help him on his journey, and I do believe that the pressure we put on the state helped get him better treatment, kept him isolated from the rest of the population. But I'm proud of what I did, even though it's caused lots of problems, and my husband didn't always agree and thought I was like totally, had become obsessed with this case, which I probably was. But I just felt that having been raised as a pastor's daughter and Christian woman, that's what religion was for, and that's what I had to do. I had to act, and I had to do my best for a child who no one had ever helped before. And thank you so much for listening.
We would be happy to answer questions, and also I've heard that someone actually learned about my story and wrote a book called The Boy Who Shot the Sheriff, and I understood she's a really brilliant woman. She's younger than Mrs. Lamson, but I've heard that she would even sign the book if you decided to buy it over at the bookstore. But if you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them for you. You have any questions? Yes?
So you're the boy on the poster who shot the sheriff, right?
Yes. I'm a little over 60 years old now, and they have this time machine that brings you back here. I don't understand it. It's really kind of strange. But I was 12 years old. I was when I did that. And
So when you're 7, you only had 5 more years to go.
to be 12, yeah.
Yeah.
So you were 20 when you got out.
I was 21 when I was released to Seattle. I was 20 when I was taken to Eastern State Hospital.
That is 8 years up.
Yeah.
Well, Mrs. Lamson doesn't look old enough to.
Mrs. Lamson is amazingly well preserved.
It was that time machine. It just blows back your hair.
And she's especially well dressed for her period.
Yeah, I was hoping that people would not think I normally dress like that.
Well, thank you all for being here. Yeah.
So did some legislation occur after this, all this publicity?
Yes, shortly after that, I'd say in the late, last half of the 1930s, they changed the laws. So, and I think they had started making improvements in the juvenile justice system so they could have kids who, go to the juvenile facility.
Thank you for telling us.
Well,
Yes.
You're very welcome.
How old is your son now?
Well, let's see. I was born in 1919, and I met Patricia in '55. I'm not as good at math as I used to be. How old I was?
Wait, it got out?
No, when Jonathan was born.
Oh, in your late 30s, I think.
Yeah, I was in my late 30s. Patricia was younger. And, that was so exciting.
And you've never told him this?
I never told him. I had nightmares about that August 5th, 1931 all my life, but I just didn't I wanted him to know me as I am now. Yes.
Did your son have a good life?
Yes, yeah, good life.
Well, he knew nothing about his father's crime until Nancy Bartley, the writer of the book, was trying to find, the details. And So one day she went to Los Angeles and she knocked on the door, and Jonathan answered, and Herbert had died some years before, and I said, oh, I'd like to talk to you about your dad. And he thought for sure it was his dad's days in Hollywood making movies. So he invited me and we started talking first about Hollywood, things like that. And finally I thought I've got to get him on the subject of the killing. And so I said, well, did your dad talk much about his time in Washington State? And his son said, well, he didn't live in Washington State. He's never been there. And I kind of looked like, of course he does. And he said, what made you think that he lived in Washington State? And I said, well, you know the trouble you got. And as soon as, then it clicked. And Patricia, his wife, Herbert's wife, came walking out and she just looked at me and she had a stroke, so she couldn't really say too much. And she just looked at me and I looked at her, and then I thought, what do I do? It never occurred to me that I would be the one who would tell the story. So Jonathan kept saying, tell me, well, what did he do? And then as I'm still speechless, he said, was it serious? And I said, yeah, you might say so. I mean, what else could you say?
You notice the time machine stopped working here.
Yeah, sorry, I can take off my hat there, right. Yeah, sorry. But so I said, yeah, you might say so. And he, and then I just said, he shot the sheriff. And there was a stunned silence, just nothing, he said nothing for quite a while, and then he said, well, that explains a lot. Because what had happened, I found out some time ago, is that he had actually one time said to his father, just randomly, he said, Dad, have you ever been in jail? And it's one of those things that maybe kids will ask, parents. But rather than saying, of course not, or no, I haven't, he said, I don't want to talk about it. And that was it. So, which means, I'm not denying anything, but it definitely meant that there was something there.
You should also tell the story of the sheriff's son.
Oh, yes, yeah. After the book came out, unfortunately, it's after the book came out. I should do an addendum or something to it. But what happened is, for a long time, it really bothered the Wormel family, Sheriff Wormel's family, for several generations. And even though they were very, very classy and restrained throughout the trial and all the publicity, and they just felt that they weren't going to be retaliatory or anything, it was just in John's memory, because John had been a legislator and a beloved sheriff. He was 73 years old when he died, and everyone loved John Wormel. So they just took the high road. And then, but he had a grandson who was his namesake, and the grandson had served in Vietnam, had been a prisoner of war, had had a horrible time in the war, and had finally was released at the end of the Vietnam War. And all the time when he was in a POW, he kept thinking about, the boy who was in jail, had been in jail, his grandfather's death, and things like that. And he decided that when he got back to the States, he was going to kill Herbert Niccolls. He was going to hunt him down and he was going to kill him. So he came back and he was all dressed in his combat fatigues, and he found that Herbert Niccolls lived in Hollywood on Citrus Avenue, and he went down there and he rang the doorbell, and Herbert answered the door. And the guy says, I'm John Wormel. And Herbert went white, absolute white. But he then recovered, invited him in. And the two of them talked and talked for hours. And Herbert told him how terrified he was during the time that he was in prison, and how sorry he was that he had never intended to do the shooting, but he was so very, very sorry, because he actually liked the sheriff. Everybody liked John Wormel. And here was his grandson. But it was a healing moment, I think, for the grandson and for Herbert, because here they were face to face. And at the end of it, Herbert Niccolls drove John Wormel's grandson to the airport to catch his plane.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, Again, thank you all.
Thank you.